Stephen Ehat has studied Chiasmus since 1973. He contributed to Jack Welch's Chiasmus bibliography, and he's begun to study what he thinks may be a Christocentric chiastic pattern evident in the entire book of Enos in the Book of Mormon. He's a California attorney, lives with his wife in Linden, Utah, and has been married for 42 years to Janine Johnson. Together they have 5 sons and now 20 grandchildren. So, I'd like to welcome Stephen Ehat here.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Isaiah prophesied, "For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." To the rich young ruler, Jesus said, "But many that are first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And of the latecomer workers who were paid equally, Jesus taught, "So the last shall be first, and the first last." Indeed, often in the scriptures, what comes first also comes last, and what comes last comes first. Isaiah quoted the Lord, "I am the first and the last." John recorded the words of the angel, "I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." Perhaps the very nature of chiasmus should remind us of the eternal nature of the Lord, who himself employed chiasmus in his teachings. Let's review some of the characteristics of chiasms, some of the joys and difficulties of detecting, evaluating, and understanding them, ways to appreciate them, care concerning our approach to them, and our need both to constantly keep in mind the underlying text and to be humble in the entire process of trying to understand chiasmus. Here are 4 guiding principles for us. First and foremost, and finally and last, we all share a love of God and an abiding respect for his sacred scriptures. Even without chiasmus, we already start our ascent from high on the mountain. These sacred texts are given by inspiration of God, profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. But awareness of chiasmus does indeed help. Second, as Dr. Noel Reynolds said informally to me, we have to allow every author to employ the range of techniques available in Hebrew rhetoric as he saw fit for the presentation of his message. Some were very creative, and others less so. Some were meticulous, and others not. It could help a lot if we had a way to discount frivolous or wrong-headed analyses, but that may come down to developed literary judgment more than legislated rules. I would here add a footnote of my own. Chiasmus must derive from the text itself. Do not wield a chiastic hammer, swinging at every text as if it were a chiasmus nail. Some refer to that as chiasmania. Sorry, not every text is chiastic, even though many are. And third, as John Welch has said, when more complex chiastic arrangements are involved, it becomes increasingly difficult to know whether the author was aware he was creating or using the form. Nevertheless, the criteria can assist in the presumption of intent. By analyzing proposed chiasms thoroughly and from a number of angles, one can assess the likelihood that an author consciously employed chiasmus in a given case to achieve a specific purpose. My footnote here is, be comprehensive. Review a text in light of all criteria. Seek first to develop a seasoned, non-modern day approach to the text. Indeed, we might ask, which criteria are more important in evaluating any given text? Well, they are all important, but they may not be equally important for all texts. For example, in 1975, David J. Clark proposed criteria based on what characteristics of chiasmus he had seen a prior scholar analyze in evaluating the Gospel of Mark. One of Clark's criteria was setting, by which he meant the location where events occurred in corresponding elements of the chiastic text. Later, in 1995, when analyzing chiasmus in the Pauline epistles, a second scholar, Ian H. Thompson, said that Clark's setting criterion was relevant only to the narrative, pericope-based style of the Gospels, but not to the Pauline epistles. Thus, it often is not only the length of the text we are analyzing, but it also may well be the very nature of the text itself, the biblical or scriptural genre, that may determine which criteria are more important and what varying rates or weights of influence should be afforded to the criteria. It may well be that the importance of certain criteria may differ, even if ever so slightly, when analyzing historical narrative, or the law or wisdom literature, the Psalms, prophecies, prophetic poetry, the Gospels, epistles, and apocalyptic texts. For example, in a gospel text, are we analyzing only a sentence, or an entire episode or pericope, or are we analyzing dialogue or discourse, etc.? And there are even suggestions on how to approach a text. That is, what steps should we take in what sequence in evaluating a text for the presence of chiasmus in light of the criteria? And fourth, as Dr. Welch says, a burden of persuasion rests on anyone asserting that a passage is chiastic. Anyone who claims that a passage is chiastic should be able to prove it. Dr. Welch and numerous other scholars say, in essence, what Thompson says. The validity of a chiasm depends on the cumulative impact of a number of criteria. In other words, one might ask, when does a text satisfy the criteria? How many criteria must be satisfied? To what extent must they be satisfied? What does it mean to satisfy a criterion? Dr. Welch speaks of the burden of persuasion. That deals with the question of who must shoulder the burden of proof. Related to that is the standard of proof, which deals with what the burden of proof actually is. Is a proposed chiasm in fact a chiasm when merely a preponderance of the evidence favors it, outweighing evidence against it, say at a 51 to 49% ratio? Or must a chiasm be proven beyond a reasonable doubt where there can be absolutely no moral or evidentiary doubt about it? Well, it probably is a standard of proof much closer to the latter than to the former. But the standard of proof should not allow for chiasmania. Chiasms are common, but they are not everywhere. Their presence must be proven. There are shorter poetic chiastic structures with two central elements, and shorter poetic concentric structures with one central element. Generally, they are not controversial or difficult to discern. But the ancients also structured longer texts with greater numbers of elements. Chiasms such as A, B, C, D, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime, and longer concentric structures such as A, B, C, D, E, D, C, B, A. This longer length chiasm is one of four of Jesus' parables that Jack Welch early on noted are chiastic. This one, chiasm comprised of 21 verses of text. We'll look at this in a moment. Although scholars may disagree, the ancients apparently used chiasmus to structure even lengthier texts, such as this one, noted by H. Douglas Buckwalter, who will speak to us later about another and different chiasm. Here, in the central 10 chapters of Luke, not only does Dr. Buckwalter expose an overall chiasm, but also within that chiasm, a number of shorter chiastic structures, and also a number of shorter, directly parallel structures. One of the two proverb-like sayings he identifies at the center reads, "There are last which shall be first, and there are first which shall be last." The other central saying is, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." The overall structure is called a macrochiasm, or large-scale chiasm. So, what are the essential features of a chiasm? What characteristics are definitional? What aspects of a chiasm are indispensable, such that without them we do not have a chiasm? The answer might simply be this: repetition, parallelism, and reversal. Or, to be as basic and precise as possible, simply parallelism and reversal, because parallelism necessarily involves repetition. Father George Mlachlil states, "A chiasm is an inverted parallelism." Dr. Wayne Brower states, "Chiasm is understood as reflexive parallelism of literary units across the midpoint of a passage." Dr. Welch states, "Chiasms are significant balanced repetitions in an inverted parallel order with a focus or shift at the center." Father John Breck states, "A chiasm is a structural form based on parallelism, but it is concentrically inverted parallelism. Similar definitions abound." Rhetoricians concur, stating that chiasmus is the repetition of ideas in inverted order, or the repetition of grammatical structures in inverted order. Strictly speaking, they say, the repetition of words in inverted order is called antimetaboly. But generally, antimetaboly is simply considered a subgroup of chiasmus. So generally, they are both called chiasmus. But to make one point here about large-scale or macro-chiasms, I'd like to focus for a moment on the distinction between antimetaboly and chiasmus. Sometimes we see reversed repetitions of words. Sometimes we see reversed repetition of ideas. Most often, we see both. For example, in this parable examined by Dr. Welch, you see repetitions of ideas represented by labels. And you also see repetitions of words and phrases. The distinction is helpful. This is antimetaboly. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. We repeat words, but not ideas. There is only one idea here. The reversal is comprised of the repeated words that combine to make only one idea. This is antimetaboly. Another example, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Two different ideas here, but not a reversal of the repetition of the two ideas. Rather, it is only the words that are simply repeated and reversed. Again, this is antimetaboly, a subset of chiasmus. Indeed, the previous example of chiasmus from Isaiah itself was part of this subgroup of chiasmus known as antimetaboly. "Woe unto all them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." However, when the texts we look at are longer, the chiasms tend to reflect more and more the reversed repetition of ideas. Moving up to a chiastic tetracolon or chiastic pentacolon, we may see this. "But in the time of their trouble they will say, Arise and save us. But where are thy gods that thou hast made? Let them arise, if they can save thee in the time of thy trouble." Note that this chiasm partakes mostly of antimetaboly, the reversed repetition of words, but now begins to reflect chiasmus proper, the reversed repetition of ideas. Once we begin to analyze even larger spans of text, such as here, all 23 verses of Genesis chapter 39, we probably first should read through the text many times, if we can, in or with the aid of the original language, and take note of and confirm what indeed is the beginning and ending of the text in question, and also take note of the key words and key phrases within the text by reference to the original language. After that, perhaps, we will find that ideas or labels concerning the account of Joseph and Potiphar's wife are what must be used to characterize each of the elements or textual units of the chiasm. The key words and key phrases themselves within each textual unit are, of course, most relevant because the main ideas are conveyed by those words and phrases. I'll go deep here for a second and then come out. In discovering the presence of what we think may be a chiasm, we note that such a larger structure is not antimetaboly. Remember that, the reversed repetition of words? It is a chiasm with repeated words and phrases, to be sure, but it mainly is repeated and reversed themes and ideas. And generally, therefore, such a text should not be analyzed as if it were antimetaboly. The key words and key phrases that help to define corresponding elements of the overall chiasm of a long text like this may or may not themselves be significant to other smaller chiastic or parallel patterns that may possibly appear within those elements. And conversely, some key words and key phrases that help to find some of the smaller chiastic or parallel patterns that may possibly appear may possibly not constitute key words and phrases that make up the larger structure. Here's an example. Dr. Buckwalter's analysis of Luke's travel narrative. It reveals an overall concentric structure of the entire text of those 10 central chapters of Luke. But when we look at any one of those elements, we see, for example, that on a lower level, there is, as here, a smaller parallel structure, ABCD, ABCD. It is defined by repeated keywords and key phrases in the two halves of that shorter parallel structure. And those keywords and phrases happen not to figure in to the elements of the longer overall chiasm. For example, here the text refers to Jesus healing a crippled woman on the Sabbath. And here the text refers to Jesus healing a man with dropsy on the Sabbath. Both events and the words associated with them being significant to identifying the smaller parallel structure within the central element of the larger concentric structure, but not significant to the overall structure that otherwise spans the entire 10 chapters. But we should not be deceived. If we cannot present enough evidence to prove the likely existence or establish the presumption that the larger structure actually exists using the criteria and a developed literary judgment, we should not substitute a hammer. Here is a personal example. In 1992, I made a rather naive, immature attempt to analyze Psalm 23, thinking I possibly could gain some insights in light of Chiasmus. Using a Hebrew lexicon, I could at least note that the psalm was comprised of 57 Hebrew words, and possibly was either chiastic or concentric, though I did not know which. So I got out my hammer and decided it was chiastic. If, like me, you are not fluent with nuances of the original language, or, like me, almost totally ignorant, don't try this. Get help. You scholars who are here, I'm not speaking to you when I say that, though you too also help one another. Notwithstanding my ignorance, conceptual parallels in the two halves and a turn at the middle seemed apparent, even in English. For the nourishing of sheep in the first half seemed parallel to the nourishing of humans in the second half. And I could see there was a meaningful shift at the center, before which we speak of the Lord in the third person. He maketh me to lie down. He leadeth me. He restoreth me. But at the shift, at the center, we begin to speak intimately to the Lord. In the second person, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, thou preparest, thou anointest. Notwithstanding this, I could also see that if I compared words in the psalm, I saw almost no repetition of exactly identical words, though there may have been different inflections of the same root, synonyms and the like, though I did not see them. But generally, only 4 words seemed to me to repeat themselves in the entire psalm. All other words seemed to appear only once each. 2 of those 4 words, of those 4 repeated words, however, were of utmost significance. Yehovah appears in verses 1 and 6, and those 2 appearances in the extremes are complemented by ki in the middle. Ki meaning for thou, or because you. Part of the central phrase, for thou art with me. Indeed, this for thou, ki, is the very middle word of the entire psalm. For thou appears only one other place, also in verse 4. The only other 2 words that repeat are lo, meaning not, in verses 1 and 4, and the word yom, meaning days, in verse 6. Well, that was the best I could do as an uncertain amateur, so a number of years later I got to wondering if my earlier study had at least been satisfactory, and I sought out what the scholars had to say. Imagine that. We agreed fairly well on the central point of the psalm. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. But they saw so much more than I did. One scholar noted why the word ki appears twice in verse 4. That is because verse 4 was itself concentric. But note also what another scholar discovered, which was plain to see if I had simply counted words. How many Hebrew words precede that central phrase, for thou art with me? 26. And how many follow it? 26. Indeed, as another scholar noted, even the number of metrical beats reflected in the Hebrew words is balanced in the 2 halves of this psalm, with 20 beats before the center and 20 beats after the center, which with each of the corresponding elements of the concentric structure evenly balanced in numbers of beats. The scholars were experts. The psalm seemed so beautiful. This seems to be intentional balance. Indeed, the text of this psalm seems to satisfy other criteria that help to establish the presumption, and yes, maybe even the likelihood, that it indeed is concentric. For example, the proposed chiasm adheres to the criterion that it should divide the text at natural breaks in the text, what Jack Welch refers to as boundaries. The Masoretic text includes accents showing the joints or seams in the text, the natural breaks, as it were. Those, in turn, determine the individual units of thought. Prosaic texts have conjunctive accents and disjunctive accents, and the poetic texts have their own set of conjunctive and disjunctive accents. And in Psalm 23, it is the major poetic disjunctive accents that are relevant. I'll mention only 2. The ends of verses are marked with a sof pasuk, which looks like a colon made out of diamonds, always accompanied by the siluk to accent the stressed syllable of the last word in the verse. And then there is the etnach, which looks like a caret, signaling a pause, roughly corresponding to our modern-day semicolon, or period, or comma, depending on the sentence. And true to form, the chiasm proposed for Psalm 23 does observe the boundaries of the text, the natural breaks in the text. Well, this is enough for our purpose presently. There indeed is balance, and there is an important message at the center. And of all things, it is a chiasm based on ideas that are represented by labels formed by the introverted repetition of the ideas or themes, but not manifest by an introverted repetition of words, except, as I say, for 2 very important words repeated in chiastically important places in the middle and at the extremes, the first and the last. Regarding balance, is this sort of balance required of a chiasm? No. Is this type of balance definitional? No. Remember, all that is needed is introverted parallelism of words or ideas that actually derives from the text itself and that is not imposed on the text by the modern reader. But true it is Balance usually accompanies introverted parallelism, even sometimes impressive balance, like we see here. Such balance often is a characteristic of a chiasm, and when it appears, it should be noted. But it perhaps should not be held up as a criterion by which alone one may qualify or disqualify a text as chiastic. But it is a criterion to consider. Is such balance as this metrical balance meaningful? Well, in poetry that is to be sung, yes, it surely is. And is the central message meaningful? Yes. Fear not, I am with thee. Maybe that message has all along been the reason why so many old Bibles have a broken spine at that point in the volume and will simply fall open to that part of the book. And maybe that's why we sing the hymn with that phrase in it. And yet, in a concentric structure over a text of this many words, we have already made the shift into representing the elements of the chiasm with labels representing ideas and themes, and we are not at all dealing with antimetaboly. Remember that? The reversed repetition of words? So a high degree of care and honest objectivity are required. Hence, the need for criteria, and even more importantly, a developed literary judgment. The ideas in the first half deal with how flocks get their food and drink in green pastures and beside still waters. And the ideas in the second half deal with how people get their food and drink at tables and with cups. The chiasm shifts the focus from flock to feast. The repeated keywords are very few, but they are very significant. And while those keywords are most important, they clearly are not the only features that account for the chiasm. We needed to look at the psalm in light of numerous criteria. The phrase, "He restoreth my soul" of verse 3, and the phrase, "Thou anointest my head with oil" of verse 5 correspond chiastically, even with no words in common. The psalm meets or satisfies most all of the scholars' criteria, and yet, so far, we have mentioned only a couple of the criteria. But we will stop here. So, Dr. Welch encourages us to analyze chiasms thoroughly and from a number of angles. And so do other scholars, telling us to look for adherence to criteria and to look for a convergence of compliance with various criteria. I fell short when I tried 25 years ago. I believed John Emerton was right when he said, "The search for examples of chiasmus has become fashionable, and some scholars appear to regard it as a key that will open many doors. While chiasmus undoubtedly appears in the Hebrew Bible, not all the examples that have been alleged stand up to detailed examination. It would help the progress of Old Testament study if those who believe that they have found instances were to be self-critical and strict in their methods and to subject their theories to vigorous testing before seeking to publish them." Well, my later recourse to the studies of the experts enhanced the experience, and anyone hearing me now can also find more and more of that sort of help by going to Jack Welch's website, chiasmusresources.org. It is a website constantly undergoing improvement, but it is already unequaled. For example, to see what studies are devoted to Psalm 23, go to the Chiasmus Index and under the Hebrew Bible, choose Psalms and scroll down to Psalm 23. Once I had begun to look for studies by other scholars, I kept track of the references, but I put them in a folder in a box and moved from one state to another, failing to contribute to Jack the references to those studies. But I found the folder while preparing this presentation and will contribute them. Meanwhile, over the years, Bob Smith especially, and others, including me, have contributed many other bibliographic references to Dr. Welch's wonderful collection, and he has put them online. You can see his collection on chiasmusresources.org under the Chiasmus bibliography link, and you yourself should consider contributing to it references that you find. These, again, are the references to studies I have seen, published by those who have analyzed Psalm 23. And I have marked here in red the ones that already are in the Chiasmus Resources bibliography, thanks to others. I'll go onto the site and use the Submit Chiasm link to suggest my additions to the bibliography. You should consider doing the same in anything you come across in studies that interest you. So let's continue our research, find studies referred to on Jack's website, and contribute references. Remember, the website is not complete. Let's read about and apply the criteria to our studies, looking for all rhetorical and structuring effects, not solely chiasmus. Let us not use a hammer. Let's enhance our experience with the scriptures. As I mentioned earlier, back in 1981, Dr. Welch showed how each of 4 of Jesus' parables form lengthy concentric structures, each drawing attention to a central idea. One such concentric parable of Jesus extends over 22 verses. It is the lengthiest of the 4 parables Jack analyzes. A sizable number of academics admire it, and it is one of my personal favorites. Here Jesus taught the parable of the 2 sons, commonly referred to as the parable of the prodigal son. A parable, however, that does not use the word prodigal, and that starts with the phrase, "A certain man had 2 sons." I quote Jack. This parable, popularly known as the parable of the prodigal son, is not a story about one son, but about 2. Both sons are equally important to the moral of the story, and one overlooks the impact of this parable by concentrating on the individual role or conduct of either son by himself. The central purpose of this parable is to illustrate the compassion of the father, and he is equally compassionate to both sons. Each son occupies a position of equivalent weight in the structure of this narrative. And both sons commit their own sins, the one by squandering and the other by not forgiving. Yet the father embraces them both. To the one he gives all, down to the fatted calf, and to the other he promises all. The point is not that there is any difference in the treatment given by the father to either son. His compassion, standing at the center of the parable, unmistakably binds together this story of the Father's love and understanding. When he says at the end, "All that I have is thine," we must not forget that this is not the conclusion or focus of the story by itself, for in fact, all that the Father has is both of theirs. End quote. Indeed, one does get the distinct impression that Jesus of Nazareth himself, who spoke this parable, consciously knew of and employed chiasmus in teaching his word, apparently himself having delivered some teachings in chiastic form, rather than chiastic forms having been superimposed on his teaching by the gospel authors or by later editors. Even the word that Jesus used to address his Father in Hebrew derives from letters presented in concentric order, Aleph, Bet, Aleph, and in Aramaic in chiastic order, Abba. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you. Now we have 5 minutes for questions, so I assume we have some out here. Here's the first one.
Well, that's a good question. The question is 26 words. How are you defining a word since you're dealing with Hebrew? That's right, because in Hebrew you can have a word have more than one meaning and vice versa. So I'm reflecting what the scholar noted, that indeed there are 26 Hebrew words before the middle and 26 Hebrew words after. Those of you who have read any of Jack Welch's studies on King Benjamin's speech and who know where you have over 1,000 words in the speech before the midpoint and 1,000 words within maybe 40 words beyond the midpoint, or Alma chapter 36. In my study of the book of Enos, what I consider to be the chiastic center of the book has 551 English words before that middle and 551 English words after that. Who knows what's going on in any other underlying language? We have to be very careful about a number of things. One is the assumption that a chiasm that appears in a large stretch of text like the travel narrative, he wasn't talking about the entire book of Luke, he was talking about the 10 chapters of the travel narrative. We have to be careful not to assume that that was the author's work. It may have been, for example, the work of a copyist later on, or a bridger, or redactionist, or whatever. There are some exceptions to that notion. For example, here you're talking about Luke. I would place Mark, as most people do, at the head of the gospel writers, the synoptics, and say that it's Mark that provides at least a start. But you've got Luke addressing himself to Greeks, and you've got Matthew addressing himself to the Jews, and you've got different audiences. So they may have, in one author looking at a prior author's work, may have superimposed a chiasm that was not there, or modified one, or rejected a prior chiasm that may have existed, and put their text in a completely different order, addressing themselves to different issues. It goes back to the first point that was made, and that is that if there is a chiasm, and for example, I'm not saying that Psalm 23 is chiastic. I think it is. Scholars, there's a whole list of scholars, about 40, that say it is, or concentric. If it is there, or in any text, is it intentional? And if it is intentional, what is the purpose of it? Why was that chiasm used as a structuring device, or as a rhetorical device, or as a mnemonic device to remember something orally? If there's a central message, it may be that Luke has a message different from that of Matthew and different than that of Mark. And then, of course, as you'll hear from Father Mlakuzil, who is here from Delhi, India, who has spent his entire life studying and understanding and exposing the beauties of the Gospel of John, that is in a whole other world. Aren't you glad I didn't say whole nother? Any others?
Thank you very much.